It's spring here in Tasmania and the garden is starting to come to life and look beautiful again with lots of flowers. And it's a very busy time in the veggie garden too, planting crops for the coming season. You're going to harvest those crops, of course, in summer. There's not a lot of harvest going on at the moment because the crops that were planted last year and even the autumn crops have generally been harvested. In terms of food coming from the garden right now, it mostly is green vegetables, things like asparagus that is growing in the spring early, some broccoli and leafy greens, but not a huge amount. And as you move towards summer, it's also going to drop back again before it explodes into the big harvest of summer. Because of this, spring is often known as the hungry time. If you were trying to live entirely from your garden, you're going to actually hit this point where food becomes somewhat scarce and the variety and the quality is going to reduce, and most importantly, the quantity. When people see our garden and our orchard, they often make the statement, "So you'd be self-sufficient then?" Well, unfortunately that's not true. The reason is that there is quite a few things that we don't produce. Even though we produce a lot of food, particularly things like apples and potatoes. If we were to look at potatoes only, we could say yes, we are self-sufficient in potatoes. There are certain foods that you can look at and say, yes, we have sufficient of those for our own needs. Of course, in using that term self-sufficient, I'm completely ignoring the outside inputs that come in terms of compost, fertilizers, and all those other things that you need, tools. I don't think if we were to look at a definition of self-sufficiency that any one person, any family, even small communities could really be totally self-sufficient for all their needs, because things like metals require a lot of skills and time that go beyond very small groups of people. So self-sufficiency, we can use that term in relation to our food supply. I think my preferred term is generally self-reliance, because to me that means looking to yourself to actually provide your needs rather than being just totally sufficient unto yourself. To actually have a look at what our diet would be like if we ate only what was coming from our garden, and particularly at this time when things are a little bit short, I decided to do a little bit of an experiment a couple of weeks ago and just for one day only eat what was produced from our garden without any extras at all. So it was entirely from our garden. Breakfast was built around apples that we had preserved. So this is a really important lesson, because I think that you can produce a lot of food, like we produce lots and lots of apples, but if we didn't do something in terms of preservation, a huge amount would be wasted. And I often see people that have fruit trees and the fruit is falling on the ground and nothing happening because it's just feeding the worms rather than themselves, because they don't put the time into preservation. So yes, the bottled apples, and also a couple of fruits that do produce early in spring. Tamarillos and kiwi fruit for us come along at that stage and provide some welcome fresh fruit. But middle of spring, that tends to disappear, and we're still waiting for the early berries like strawberries and so on to come on. This combination though still made quite a delicious breakfast. Lunchtime was built largely around potatoes. Again, we're not harvesting those at this time of the year. These potatoes were actually harvested around 6 months ago and have been in storage over winter. At this stage, it becomes quite urgent to eat them because they are attempting to grow. However, there's still some carrots coming out of the garden, again, that have been overwintering in the garden, and those leafy greens. A little bit of citrus coming around with some oranges starting to pick, so that made quite a nice salad. Again, lunch was enjoyable, but you still felt like you were missing something a little bit. For an evening meal, again coming back to potatoes, things like asparagus, of course, which are really exciting, and of course the hens are laying well this time of the year, so plenty of eggs available. So while this seems not too bad for a day's eating, there's a few things missing. Now, this food test was filmed a few weeks ago, and what's in the garden has changed, and as I predicted, it actually has reduced quite significantly. The carrots are no longer there, and really it's only greens that are picking right now. So you would still be very heavily reliant on things like those potatoes, which have been in storage. But what's missing? Well, I know some people are going to say, where's the meat? We're a vegetarian, so that's not really an issue. However, if you really need it, there's plenty of forest out there, and I'm sure you can find something. But what I missed over that day was the high energy foods that we usually consume. Firstly, for breakfast, I would normally include some seeds and nuts. Now, we have a couple of nut trees, but they're only young, and serious production is a long way off. So at this stage, we heavily rely on purchasing nuts and seeds as part of our diet. With lunch and dinner, it was again fats that I missed, things like oils and butter. Now, production of oils isn't the easiest thing to achieve. Probably the easiest seed and oil seed to produce would be sunflower seeds in this area, and that could be done, but they require some processing and a little bit of technology to do that. Butter is an easy one to produce if you have pasture, but we have forest, and the forest of course provides us some good things like firewood, and it also has provided timber for building our house, but it isn't easily converted into pasture, and to achieve that would be quite a bit of effort. But having livestock and producing milk and butterfat particularly would be a really valuable inclusion in our diet, and for anybody that is wanting to achieve self-sufficiency. Now, as I said, this was filmed a few weeks ago, and in the meantime, the Irish couple, Tim and Sandra from Way Out West channel, released a video on self-sufficiency. I thought it was interesting that they made the comment that it wouldn't necessarily be healthy to be self-sufficient. And I think this is true because in many parts of the world, the soil is deficient. Major deficiencies that I can think of are iodine, selenium, boron, and if you're eating food only produced from that deficient soil, you can run into some health problems. So if you are really trying for self-sufficiency and eating a lot of your own food, you do really need to consider that you have the full elements there in terms of those trace elements, because otherwise it's going to affect your health in the long term. But of course, you can live from it in the short term. And for us, really the goal isn't self-sufficiency here and now and continuously. Rather, the things that we look for is, number one, that we like to know where our food comes from and know that herbicides and pesticides haven't been used on it, that it is organically grown. That's very important to us. The other element that we look for is some food security. We don't like to rely on the supermarket, which is a very risky situation, and prefer to have that security of knowing where our food supply comes from and that we can produce it. So in summary, I think self-sufficiency in terms of food is possible. You're not going to achieve 100% self-sufficiency in terms of all your needs unless you want to live a Stone Age lifestyle, but food certainly is possible. But whether you're going to want to achieve it, particularly in today's situation where we're used to a far more varied diet, is another question. Of course, purchasing food requires some money as an extra factor, and that's something that I will talk about in a future video. So I hope you enjoyed this video and the little experiment in what it's like to live entirely from your garden. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more.